So, you want to own a cyber cafe, a room full of glowing monitors, headsets clicking on, the low hum of 40 machines running at once, someone printing a boarding pass at midnight, a group of teenagers crowding around one screen while their friend plays. On paper, it looks like one of the simplest businesses a person can start. Buy some computers, plug in the internet, charge by the hour. People walk in. People pay. You count the money at the end of the night. No perishables. No supply chain. No inventory to restock. That's the picture almost everyone carries into this business. It's also almost completely wrong, because a cyber cafe was never really in the business of renting out computers. It's in the business of racing a clock that starts the moment you plug the last machine in. A clock that has nothing to do with how many customers walk through your door tonight, and everything to do with how fast the outside world moves on without you. Miss the distinction, and you can be fully booked every night of the week and still be losing money by the time you notice. Here's the deal almost nobody sees coming when they sign the lease. You buy 40 machines. You've spent somewhere between $80,000 and $200,000 before a single customer sits down. Sometimes far more if you're chasing a premium gaming crowd. From the outside, everyone assumes you now own 40 computers. What you actually own is 40 depreciating assets on a countdown timer. Assets that lose real, measurable value every single month, whether they're occupied or sitting empty. And that timer runs whether business is good or bad. Once you see the distinction, the whole industry flips inside out. So let's walk into the room, station by station. Start with the question almost nobody asks before opening one of these. Why would this be a hard business? When the product is so simple, the demand looks obvious, and the setup looks like nothing more than furniture and wiring? Because the thing people are actually paying for isn't internet access anymore, and hasn't been for a long time. Most of the developed world solved the internet access problem years ago. What a cyber cafe sells today is hardware the customer can't justify owning themselves. And hardware is the one product category on Earth engineered, on purpose, by an entire global industry, to become worse every single year relative to what's newly available. That single fact is the whole business, buried under the furniture. Picture the two extremes standing side by side, because they make the entry cost easier to feel than any spreadsheet does on its own. At one end, a stripped-down setup in a smaller city, second-hand machines, basic internet, a handful of seats crammed into a modest storefront, opened for well under $50,000 total. At the other end, a flagship gaming lounge built to compete for the serious esports crowd, top-tier graphics cards in every seat, a dedicated tournament stage, high-refresh monitors, a proper kitchen, and a build-out bill that can comfortably clear $500,000 before the doors ever open. Both venues are technically the same business on paper. Only one of them is actually built to survive the hardware cycle that's coming for it in 2 or 3 years. And it isn't the cheap one. Here's where most first-time owners misjudge this completely. Everyone budgets for the opening cost, the computers, the desks, the signage, the internet line, and assumes that's the investment. It actually runs on 3 separate clocks, and the space between them is where the real economics live. The first clock is the lease, fixed, predictable, the same every month whether the seats are full or empty. The second is the utility and staffing cost, which moves a little with usage, but mostly just runs, hour after hour, day after day, because a room full of computers and air conditioning doesn't idle quietly the way an empty retail shop does. The third clock, the one that actually determines whether this business survives past year 3, is the hardware refresh cycle, and unlike the other two, this one isn't monthly. It arrives every 2 to 4 years as a single, enormous bill, and if you don't have the cash sitting aside for it, the business you built simply stops being competitive, seat by seat, while the rent keeps running exactly the same. Take a real story. South Korea had roughly 100 of these venues at the end of 1997. Within 3 years, that number had exploded past 15,000. By 2001, it had crossed 23,000, driven almost entirely by one thing: a single video game, a real-time strategy title called StarCraft. that sold over 1 million copies in Korea alone and turned these rooms into the default hangout for an entire generation. Owners who got in during that window weren't running a service business. They were running the hottest ticket in the country. At a moment when demand outstripped supply so completely that a new location could open across the street from an existing one and both would still be full every night. That boom created an entire generation of overnight success stories. And it created something else too. A wave of new owners who assumed the boom was the business model, instead of a temporary, unrepeatable spike sitting on top of the actual business model underneath it. Here's the part that separates the venues still standing today from the thousands that quietly closed. A regular retail shop competes on price and convenience. A cyber cafe, once it stops being new, competes almost entirely on hardware. Because the exact customer paying premium rates, the serious gamer, is comparing your machines against whatever the newest graphics card can render, updated constantly, whether you've upgraded or not. That's not competition working in the owner's favor. That's a countdown clock working against every single machine in the building, whether a customer ever sits down at it or not. South Korea still runs roughly 20,000 of these venues today, a number that has held remarkably steady even as the original reason for their existence, a lack of home internet, disappeared entirely. Hourly rates typically run somewhere between roughly 50 cents and $2.50. And the average visit lasts around 2.5 hours. Across the whole country in 2025, total hours logged inside these rooms added up to roughly 780 million, a genuinely enormous number, and one that had actually ticked down slightly from the year before, a quiet signal of a market that peaked and is now managing a long, gradual plateau rather than a boom. The owners who are still profitable inside that plateau learned something the boom-era owners never had to learn. The room isn't really selling seat hours anymore. It's selling a specific kind of relevance, and relevance has to be repurchased, in cash, every couple of years, whether last year was a good one or not. Here's the part that surprises almost everyone who's never actually run one of these venues. You'd assume the money is made from the hourly rate, the sign on the door, the reason customers walk in. It's frequently the opposite. In the most mature version of this business, the hourly fee for the seat is close to a loss leader, and the actual profit sits somewhere the customer barely notices, the food and drink menu. A modern venue in Korea today looks less like an old-fashioned internet cafe and closer to a hybrid restaurant with computers bolted to the tables. Ramen, fried chicken, energy drinks, snacks, all ordered from the screen in front of you and delivered directly to the seat without ever standing up. A customer who came in to play for 2 hours and ends up ordering food twice has just turned a low-margin hourly rental into a genuinely profitable visit. And the venue didn't have to raise its posted hourly rate by a single cent to make it happen. That's the first real oh moment in this business. The glowing monitors are the marketing. The kitchen behind the counter is frequently the actual profit engine. And this is a good place to pause. If this kind of breakdown is doing something for you, hitting subscribe genuinely helps more of these find their way to you. Back to the room. Not every country tells the same story, and the differences are where the real lesson sits. In Taiwan, the number of internet cafes has fallen by more than half since 2011, based on the country's own tax filings. A decline steep enough that landlords have actively repurposed those storefronts for entirely different businesses. In China, the industry peaked at roughly 150,000 venues in 2016 and had fallen to around 138,000 just 2 years later, with analysts projecting a continuing annual decline of several percent, year after year, as smartphone ownership and home broadband finished the job cyber cafes were originally built to solve. Singapore tells the starkest version of this story. The entire city-state, a market of over 4.5 million people, is now down to roughly a dozen of these venues still operating, a number that would have sounded absurd 20 years ago. Then there's the Philippines, and this is where the story stops being simple. While Taiwan, China, and Singapore were shrinking, the Philippines went the other direction entirely. And today, the country counts several thousand of these venues still operating, a number that has actually grown over the past decade rather than collapsed. Long-running local chains like Netopia never disappeared. They adapted, layering in printing services, gaming, and document work for a customer base that still, even now, doesn't universally own a personal computer at home. Even as smartphone ownership across the country has climbed well above 90%. That's the contradiction sitting at the center of this entire industry. The same disruption, the same smartphone in every pocket, killed this business in one country and left it completely intact 2,000 miles away. The difference was never really about the phones. It was about whether a personal computer, the actual hardware being rented by the hour, was still something the average customer genuinely couldn't afford to own for themselves. Wherever a computer stopped being the barrier, the internet cafe version of this business quietly died. Wherever it didn't, it kept going, more or less unchanged. But even in markets where the venues survived, survival didn't mean the original business model survived with them. It got replaced by something closer to a gaming lounge wearing the same sign out front. Let's actually run the numbers the way a serious operator would before signing a lease, because this is where the fantasy quietly turns into a spreadsheet. Take a mid-sized gaming-focused venue, 40 machines, decent but not flagship specifications. Equipment alone can run somewhere between $80,000 and $200,000. Add commercial internet bandwidth, price well above a home connection because dozens of users are streaming and gaming at once, plus furniture, networking hardware, security systems, and a point-of-sale setup. And the number to simply open the doors easily clears $250,000 for anything beyond the most bare-bones setup. Then the ongoing bill starts. And this is the part that quietly erodes owners who didn't plan for it. 50 machines running high-performance components for 10 to 14 hours a day, air conditioning fighting the heat all of them generate simultaneously, can push a single location's monthly electricity bill into four figures in many markets, arriving in full whether the room was half empty or completely booked. Staffing adds technicians on call for hardware failures, front desk coverage across long or overnight hours, and in markets with strict regulation around minors and curfews, someone whose entire job is compliance, checking IDS, enforcing cutoff times, making sure the venue doesn't lose its license over a rule nobody in the room was thinking about at 11 at night. Layer in software next, because it's the cost that's easiest to forget until an inspector walks in. Operating systems used commercially require business tier licensing, not the consumer license that came with the machine, and increasingly, major game publishers require separate commercial or cybercafe licensing agreements before their titles can legally be installed and monetized on a fleet of rental machines at all. It's rarely a huge line item on its own, but it recurs every single year, on every machine, completely disconnected from how many hours those machines actually got used, and skipping it isn't a savings. It's a liability sitting quietly on the books until someone eventually checks. And then the bill nobody prices into their business plan at all. Every 2 to 4 years, the hardware needs a real refresh. At minimum the graphics cards, sometimes the whole machine, because the exact customers paying premium rates are the ones who will simply walk 2 blocks to a newer venue the moment yours starts falling behind. Skip that refresh once to protect cash flow, and you don't just lose a little business. You risk falling permanently out of relevance with the customer segment that was paying your actual margin. Run the honest math on year 5, and the picture is stark. A venue that opened for $200,000, held its equipment for 4 years past the point it should have upgraded, and lost its highest spending regulars to a newer venue nearby isn't looking at a slow year. It's looking at a structural collapse in exactly the customers who made the model profitable in the first place. While the lease and the electricity bill kept running at full speed, completely indifferent to any of it. Here's the part that surprises almost everyone who assumes the owner is the one who wins in this business, if anyone does. Look closely at who actually gets paid, reliably, whether the venue is thriving or barely surviving. And it's rarely the person whose name is on the lease. The landlord collects rent every month regardless of foot traffic, on a storefront that costs them nothing extra to maintain once it's built out. The equipment supplier or leasing company gets paid for every machine the moment it ships, whether that machine still has real resale value in 3 years or not. The utility company collects a full bill whether the seats were half empty or completely booked. In markets with commercial software licensing, the publisher or licensing agency collects an annual fee that has nothing to do with how many hours were actually logged that year. Even the technician who shows up to replace a failed graphics card gets paid in full for the visit, regardless of whether the venue's evening rush ever fully recovers from the downtime. The owner is frequently the only person in the entire chain whose payday depends on getting the timing, the hardware cycle, and the local competition right, all at once, year after year. A few chains have figured out how to flip that arrangement in their own favor, and it's worth understanding how. Rather than owning every machine outright, some larger operators lease core hardware on rolling contracts, effectively converting an unpredictable multi-year capital expense into a smoother, more predictable monthly cost, closer to how a gym finances its equipment than how a corner shop buys its shelving. It doesn't eliminate the underlying obsolescence problem. The hardware still ages exactly as fast, but it changes who absorbs the shock of the upgrade cycle, and it's frequently the difference between an owner who survives one bad hardware generation and one who doesn't. Japan tells a stranger version of this same story, one that reveals just how far a cybercafe can drift from its original purpose once the economics around it shift. In Tokyo and Osaka, a meaningful share of manga and internet cafe customers aren't gamers passing through for an evening at all. They're people using overnight private booths, complete with a reclining chair, a shower, and a locker, as a cheaper alternative to renting an apartment, a phenomenon widely covered in the Japanese press as net cafe refugees. For those venues, the computer and the internet connection became almost secondary to the real product. A legally gray, extremely cheap form of overnight shelter in one of the most expensive rental markets on earth. It's the same physical layout as a gaming-focused PC Bang in Seoul, and an almost entirely different business model wearing it. There's a version of this business emerging in markets that never had a first-generation cybercafe boom at all, and it's worth pausing on, because it proves the underlying economics rather than contradicting them. In the United States, India, and parts of the Middle East, a new wave of premium esports lounges and gaming cafes has opened over the past several years. Built entirely around flagship graphics cards, competitive tier monitors, and tournament hosting, charging considerably more per hour than an old-fashioned internet cafe ever did. These venues aren't solving the original problem, a lack of home internet access, at all. Almost every customer walking in already has broadband and a phone in their pocket. What they're paying for is hardware genuinely out of reach for an average household. The exact same underlying trade the earliest Korean PC bangs were built on, just repackaged for a market with no cybercafe history to draw on. It's the clearest possible proof that this was never really an internet business. It was always a hardware access business wearing whatever branding happened to fit the decade. There's a regulatory layer sitting underneath all of this that has nothing to do with hardware and everything to do with the fact that these venues have always attracted more government attention than a typical retail shop. South Korea restricts younger teenagers from playing certain online games during overnight hours, a rule that directly shapes how these venues can legally operate late at night. Multiple countries require operating licenses, ID checks, or age verification systems specifically because these spaces have historically been linked to underage gambling, piracy, and, in some markets, genuine public concern over gaming addiction among minors. A single serious violation, an unmonitored piracy incident, an underage customer playing past curfew, can trigger a fine or a full license revocation, regardless of how healthy the books looked the month before. None of that shows up on the walkthrough with a leasing agent. All of it shows up eventually in a fine, an inspection, or a forced closure that has nothing to do with how many customers actually wanted to be there. Put a good year and a bad year side by side, and the gap becomes impossible to ignore. In a strong year, a well-run venue rides a hardware refresh at time correctly, right before a major game launch drives a fresh wave of players through the door, keeps its premium seats full through evenings and weekends, and layers enough food and beverage revenue on top of the hourly rate to comfortably cover the lease, the electricity, and the staff, with real profit left over. In a weak year, that same 40-seat room eats a graphics card refresh it can barely afford. Watches its highest spending regulars drift to a newer venue that opened 2 blocks away with better specs. Absorbs a licensing fine after an unmonitored piracy incident on a machine nobody was watching at 2 in the morning. And finishes the year with a bill for electricity and rent that never once adjusted for how quiet the room actually was. Same floor plan, same 40 seats, same neighborhood, and the entire financial outcome hinges on one decision made months earlier. Whether the owner refreshed the hardware on schedule or tried to stretch one more year out of machines the market had already moved past. Step back from the monitors and the countdown timers. And this business teaches something bigger about any company built around physical assets inside a fast-moving technology cycle. A cyber cafe looks like a real estate business, a room, a lease, foot traffic through the door. It actually behaves like a technology company trapped inside a real estate business, one where the core inventory has a built-in shelf life measured in a couple of years, not decades, and where standing still isn't neutral. Standing still is decline, quiet and compounding, whether or not a single customer ever complains out loud. That's the same trap sitting underneath every asset-heavy business chasing a technology curve it can't control. Data centers, recording studios, camera rental houses, print shops. The equipment was never really the asset. The willingness to keep replacing it, on schedule, in cash, whether or not this was a good year, is the actual business being run. There's one final piece of this worth sitting with, because it explains why the industry never fully dies even as individual markets shrink. Somewhere in the world, right now, a new technology gap is opening up between what people can access at home and what a shared commercial space can offer them at scale. Whether that's a graphics card too expensive for an average household, a piece of specialized software licensed only for commercial use, or simply a stable connection in a country where home broadband still hasn't caught up. Wherever the gap exists, some version of this business reappears, under a different name, with a different sign out front, running the exact same underlying trade 100 Korean entrepreneurs stumbled into by accident in 1997. A cyber cafe was never really selling internet access, and in most of the world today, it isn't selling gaming seats for their own sake either. It's selling relevance, rented out by the hour, on hardware carrying a countdown timer nobody sitting in the room can see. And the owners who forget that timer exists are the ones who wake up one year to find the room still full of chairs and completely empty of customers. Before you go, the description box has a deeper breakdown of how survivors in different countries actually structured their pivot away from the original business. Worth a look if you want to go further on this. And that's the real story behind the glowing monitors. If this was useful, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Thanks for watching.